What's up everyone? Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Paris and I make videos all about candle making and the starting and managing of my small candle business, LadyCIMONNE Candle Co. Today we are talking about the most common candle making problems. Let's just be real. I'm gonna just say it. Making candles or being a candle maker can sometimes be a love-hate relationship. Love because who doesn't love candles, right? But as a candle maker, it's a different type of feeling when you actually hand make a product to give to someone and they get to kind of experience your aromas and experience your story through the scents that you offer, right? But then, you know, it can be kind of very, very frustrating because, you know, here you go making a batch of candles and then let's say this batch just comes out totally wrong and it's just like, what did I do? I've done all this testing and I don't understand why this batch turned out this way. It's very frustrating. I totally feel you, and I am going to help you troubleshoot today. So let's just get started. You all know the deal. I have my laptop here with my talking points, so let's hop right in. Number one, sinkholes. That's probably one of the most annoying things ever. After your candle cools, you notice a sinkhole. This occurs due to a couple of reasons. Number one, your air gets trapped into the wax during the actual candle making process, or the candle cools too quickly due to pouring the hot wax into a super cold container. So let's troubleshoot that. One of the things you can do is get you a handy heat gun. That is something I've mentioned several times on my channel. It's actually one of the basic beginner tools and equipment that you need. If you haven't checked out that download, click the link in my description box to get your list. That is on that list. A heat gun is crucial during the candle making process. So what you can do is put your heat gun on low setting and hold it over top of your candle about 6 or so inches away, because you don't want to burn anything. And just kind of run it over the top of your candle until you achieve a full even melt pool, to then kind of pour itself into that hole and fill it up. And once it cures, then the top will smooth itself out. Another way you can do this is if you have like some leftover wax, like some leftover flakes or whatever that you were using, melt those really quick and just pour on over top of your candle. I don't want you to necessarily worry about the ratio at that point, like, oh, I've calculated the amount of wax and oil to the T, and I don't want to mess that up. And it's the same thing as creating that melt pool from the first step. You're just kind of pouring over a nice even layer to kind of fill in that hole. Number two, cold throw versus hot throw. I have not only had this happen to me during my beginner process, even now when I'm testing out new fragrances that I want to release in my candle line, I still experience this, guys. So you are not alone. This is when you make your candles and they have set and you smell it, the cold throw, bomb, right? You're like, oh, this is gonna be bomb. And then once you light it, you're like, where's the scent? Like, what happened? This occurs for a couple of reasons. Number one, you either didn't add enough fragrance oil, or number two, depending on the flash point of the fragrance oil, you could have added it at a too high of a temperature in your wax and it kind of burned off prior to your pouring temperature. So let's troubleshoot that. Number one, adjust your fragrance load percentage. I have talked about this several times in my video. Most commonly, fragrance load percentages range between 6 and 12%. That's a big gap to test with, right, guys? When I used 464 soy, I settled on a 10%. It worked for me. I didn't have any issues with my cold or hot throw. So I would start playing with those percentages And if need be, if your wax can hold up to 12%, try testing at 11 or 12% using the calculation that I taught a few videos back on how to calculate that ratio. Check out that video to then plug in different percentages and test those out. Another thing you can do is check to see what temperature to add your fragrance oil at. Most candle suppliers will let you know, depending on what wax you use, it will let you know what's a good temp to add your fragrance oil. And that can kind of be a gray area too. A lot of people, most commonly, they say add your fragrance oil at 185. But in my experimenting, I've noticed that adding it at a cooler temperature with the fragrance load percentage that I've chosen, it works a little better, and my cold throw is kind of reserved. So I normally add mine at 165. But again, test yours, because every fragrance load's strength, right? Every fragrance oil's strength. Some are stronger than others, guys. So make sure you read your fragrance oil and the type of wax you use and kind of test different adding temperatures. It's always best to go with what's recommended, but sometimes that may not always work depending on the strength of your oil. So just kind of test it out and see. And then number 3, what I've noticed a lot of beginner candle makers fail to do is stir sufficiently. You'd be surprised that something as simple as just stirring for longer periods of time to ensure that wax and oil is fully binded makes a huge difference. I stir at least 2 minutes. I'll set my timer and on my phone, and I would just stir until I hear the sound go off, just to ensure. Stir slow and gently, and I kind of change directions as well, just to make sure it's fully binded. You'd be surprised how much of a difference that can make. Number 3, candle sweating. This occurs most likely because too much fragrance oil was added to the wax, and then once the candle is setting and curing, the rest of the fragrance oil that the wax could not hold begins to seep through the top of the candle, and it looks like little wet droplets on your candle. It's kind of like a rain cloud. Like when the cloud can't hold any more moisture, it rains. That's pretty much what happens in this situation. One would think that adding more fragrance oil will increase the hot throw of the candle, and I want to break that myth for you today. There is a science, guys, to the wax and fragrance oil ratio. Not every wax can handle a lot of fragrance oil. So whatever wax you decide on, ensure you are reading, what the fragrance load percentage, the max it can hold, and then test down from there to see what hot throw is pleasing to you. So I do not want you all to walk away with that misconception that the more oil you add, the stronger it smells. So let's troubleshoot and fix that. So again, number 1, I've said this in previous clips, check your fragrance load percentage. Test. That is the key. And I know it can be frustrating, but it has to be done, guys. And then number 2, again, make sure you are stirring sufficiently. If you know you are in the right fragrance load range and you like it, just make sure you're stirring sufficiently, guys. I'm telling you, that step alone can ensure that the wax and oil is truly binded together. It makes a difference. Number 4, tunneling. This occurs because the wick consumes too much fuel too fast. Fuel equals wax plus fragrance oil. When that compound comes together, that is fuel, and that fuel is burned up through the wick, releasing the aroma that we all love to smell, right? But when that happens too fast, it creates a tunneling effect throughout the bottom of your candle instead of achieving a full melt pool after a 3 to 4 hour burn session. So let's troubleshoot that. Most likely adjust your wick size. If the wick is too small, it will not achieve a full melt pool. It will just stay right there, a small little melt pool right in the center, and it will not be able to reach a full melt pool from edge to edge of your container. But if the wick is way too big, it will consume the fuel too fast, creating that tunneling effect that I just mentioned. So adjust your wick size, and I would recommend contacting the supplier. If you don't know which path to take, contact them and say, hey, this is the wax I'm using, this is the size container I'm using. Especially if you order from them, they'll be able to kind of give you a recommended wick size and or series to test with, and sometimes they even give a backup to try as well. So it all comes down to, you know, your wick size. It's either too small or too big. Number 5, wet spots. Wet spots is pretty much a brief way of describing wax that has separated from the jar. Another word that they like to toss around is poor jar adhesion. The wax just failed to adhere to the jar properly as it cooled and set. So let's troubleshoot. Number one of the things you can do is preheat your jar, clean and preheat your jar. I always recommend cleaning. I normally wipe out my jars with just paper towel and alcohol. After all of that shipping and being in card boxes, a lot of dust and particles can be on your jar. And so I like to kind of give mine a good wipe out. Preheat your oven. I normally preheat my oven to about 170. So, you know, you don't want it too hot. But I normally do like 170, and I put my jars in the oven for a little while, just until they're pretty warm to the touch, and then I take them out. So you are more than welcome to do that. There are some candle makers that use a heat gun to actually heat their jars. You can take your heat gun and just kind of run it throughout the inside and outside of your container prior to pouring your wax in. This will help sufficiently slow down the cooling process so that it actually has time to truly cure and bind to the jar. Another option is try pouring at about 5 to 10 degrees cooler. You know, if you're pouring at 185, try pouring at about 170 and see how that works for you. Or 175, I'm sorry, that's 10 degrees. Try pouring at a cooler temperature so that way it's not so hot and the container isn't being hit with such a hot wax and therefore cooling the wax too fast. And then another option is space out your jars when cooling. I use racks or like baking sheets sometimes, and I, you know, space them out so that way they have an even cooling process kind of floating around each jar, and they're not so close to the touch that they don't have time to, you know, cure on its own heat. So you can try those options and see if that can help kind of minimize the wet spots. But I don't want you to be so discouraged and alarmed when it happens. It happens, guys. Sometimes, you know, it's just what happens when you're making candles and the curing process. But those tips can kind of help minimize how often this occurs. Number 6, cracking. Cracking that you kind of notice at the top of your candle. It almost looks like your candle is just not even. If you look closely, you'll see that there's most likely a crack. This occurs for a couple of reasons. During the curing process, your wax shrunk. Pretty much, that's kind of that in a nutshell. As it was curing, it shrunk on itself. Number 2, air bubbles most likely got trapped in the wax. So as it's curing, pretty much the wax sunk where the air bubbles left a gap. So if there's air bubbles trapped in the wax while it's curing, that gap that's left, that little air pocket, the wax then shrunk where that is. So I do want to preface this by saying this does not affect the performance of the candle. I know some people have reached out to me worried about it. It does not impact the overall performance of the candle, I promise you. But I'm going to help you troubleshoot that to fix it. Number 1 is adjust the pouring temperature plus or minus 5 degrees. Sometimes you know, depending on the temperature you pour, just like with other imperfections that occurs, sometimes that pouring temperature can help alleviate those air bubbles. So test with the temperature, ±5 degrees, and find a good pouring temp that will leave little room for imperfections. Use a cooling rack. I just mentioned in the previous clip, I use a cooling rack, and sometimes with your candles being elevated on a cooling rack, it achieves an even airflow. So that way all your candles have an even opportunity to cool and cure properly, to avoid any air pockets getting in there. This goes back to a previous clips before. Use a heat gun to fix it. I'm telling you, y'all, the heat gun will be your best friend. I get excited when I talk about the heat gun because it saves your life when you're batching a bunch of candles and you're like, what the heck, what happened? Like this batch turned out totally wrong. Get you a heat gun, boo. I promise you. Take that heat gun and run it over top of that candle. Create an even melt pool to then smooth out the top of the candle. You can always also pour leftover wax, as I've mentioned before. If you got a few flakes left over that you don't mind using, melt those really quick and pour a nice even layer of wax and let it cool and create that smooth top for you to fix that. And the last common candle making problem that I want to discuss, number 7, is wax discoloration. I've had this happen. You make a bunch of inventory and it's not moving off the shelves as quickly because you want to give your candles time to set before you put out orders, which is pretty normal. You know, the longer you cure your candles, the better they smell. And so, but over time, you start to notice that maybe like towards the bottom of your candle, there's kind of a yellowish tint to it. So this occurs for a couple of reasons. You could have, number 1, overheated your wax. This can easily happen. Sometimes you lose track of time and your train of thought, and you're trying to keep an eye on your wax. You're trying to get your candle jars prepped. You're working in a lot of different stations, and you could have just left your wax on too long. Number 2 is your candle is being exposed to too much sunlight, direct sunlight and or artificial light over time, depending on where you store your candles. That's why a lot of times you hear them say store them in a cool, dry, you know, kind of a dark area, so that way it's not exposed to too much natural light and or artificial light just over time. It doesn't happen like right away. It sometimes happens like over time. Or number 3, your fragrance oil that you used or fragrance oils that you use in your line could have too much vanillin in it. I want to make sure I said that right. When I first was researching why this occurs, when it first happened to me, because I was distraught. I'm like, why does my candle look like this? So I was distraught. So, you know, I immediately went on Google, like, what the heck is going on with my candles? And I realized that a lot of fragrance oils, especially more on the citrusy side, contains vanillin. And so, you know, I had to look up that. I'm like, well, what is vanillin? Vanillin is actually a compound found in vanilla extract that is used in a lot of maybe base or middle notes in fragrance oils. And I didn't know that until it happened to me and I got on Google and found out why. So let's troubleshoot. Number 1, if your fragrance oil has vanillin in it, what you can do is get some ivory candle dye, whether that's block form or liquid, whatever your thing is. Get some ivory dye and put a little bit of ivory dye in your wax to kind of help offset that coloring, that yellowish tint that could occur, and it will kind of help achieve kind of a, you know, an even color, like it, you know, a uniform color. Another thing you can do is use a UV inhibitor, which pretty much is a fancy word for saying It's kind of like a sunscreen for your candles. It helps prevent, you know, candles and wax turning into that yellowish tint. A lot of candle suppliers sell it. I know for sure that the Flaming Candle sells UV inhibitor. So if you notice that your candles are doing that quite often, maybe you can try adding some of that. And the last option that can kind of help you out if the first couple that I mentioned is not working for you or is not giving you the desired results that you want, then you may just have to kind of rethink your candle line, your fragrance oil line, and just maybe look at oils that don't contain, that contains little to no vanillin in the oil. So make sure you read up on what oils you're buying. But I mean, again, this happens over time. I don't want you all to feel like it's going to happen like overnight. It's not. And especially if you're selling candles, you know, your candles are going to be, you know, leaving your shelves soon anyway. But if your candles have been sitting for a while and you're starting to notice this happening, try implementing the tips that I just mentioned, and that should kind of help minimize this happening. So I hope you all have enjoyed this video. I hope this has been able to answer a lot of your candle making problems that have or is occurring. I've experienced these candle problems myself, so you are not alone. And so I just wanted to bring a troubleshooting video to you to kind of help you not only grow in your candle making skills and perfecting the craft, but just give you some overall candle making knowledge that I feel like everybody should learn if you're trying to engross yourself in this industry, because it's important. You know, if things happen while you're making candles, you know, you can be able to pull out these troubleshooting tips and apply them, especially in your testing process. So when you go to sell candles, you'll know what to do and what not to do to give your customers the best in quality of your line. I also, guys, have a troubleshooting guide. Here in this video, I've listed and talked with you about 7 of the most common, but I have a full troubleshooting guide that is available today to download if you are interested. So make sure you click on the link below to get your troubleshooting guide. You can print it out, keep with all your candle making supplies or wherever you store your papers or your labels, and keep that close by, so that way if you run into a problem, you can immediately refer to the troubleshooting guide and get your troubleshooting on and fix your situation that, you know, that have maybe occurred during your candle making process. I often refer to this guide myself. These are all the tips and troubleshooting tips that I have kind of documented throughout my candle making journey thus far. This is not only through my experience, but this is also through research. This is also through me networking with other candle makers and just having good conversation about what to do when this happens and what shouldn't I do to avoid this particular imperfection. So make sure you go to the description box and download your troubleshooting guide from me today to keep with you. And until next time, bye.